I don't know.
Someone on a train.
You usually get kids and dogs on these, but I don't know about a train.
We had potato chips one time on our snow access emergency call.
So how's everyone doing this evening?
Great.
Welcome to the finance session. There's a little bit of background noise coming off of the telephone. It sounds like a copier or something like that.
Or a train.
Or a train.
They can mute it, right? That way we don't have to hear it. There you go. Thank you.
Great. Okay. Okay, tonight's agenda will be, we're going to cover financial accounting, we're going to cover managerial accounting, and financial management. Financial accounting involves basic accounting functions of data entry, transaction analysis, and the preparation and interpretation of financial statements for internal managers and external stakeholders. For a not-for-profit organization, the benefit of the financial statements are for the Board of Trustees and senior management. For a for-profit organization, the benefit is for the stakeholders. The stakeholders include shareholders, other investors that are considering investing in a particular for-profit healthcare organization. And in the case of a for-profit organization, the financial statements must adhere to GAAP. GAAP is generally accepted accounting principles. That's a SEC requirement. Managerial accounting focuses on internal use of accounting information for decision making. In this particular case, this is actually focused on the internal management of a healthcare organization. With this information, the healthcare organization can conduct cost analysis. They can determine the efficiency of processes from a cost perspective and analyze the effectiveness of certain processes or departments. Financial management focuses on asset management with an emphasis on cash flow. And we'll talk about that in some detail at the end of this session. Primary outputs of financial accounting are financial statements. The financial statements include the income statement, balance sheet, and a statement of cash flows. At very least, those are going to be the three that we concern ourselves with this evening. There's also a financial statement that is specific to equity, but we're not going to talk about that tonight. So our income statement. The income statement reports revenue and expenses over a certain period of time. Reports whether or not the organization had a net loss or a net profit. The balance sheet. The balance sheet actually shows the financial position of an organization at a certain date of time. The day that that balance sheet is presented, that will actually tell you the date in which those particular items on the balance sheet occurred or the status at that particular date. The last item we're going to talk about is the cash flow statement, which shows the inflow and outflow of cash coming in and out of the organization from their perspective of operations, investing in the organization, and financing the organization. Let's take a look at Temple's, an example of Temple's financial statement. This is Temple's actual financial statement from 05 and 04. Okay, what we have here, can everyone see this? This is Temple's actual balance sheet. The balance sheet is comprised of all the assets. The current assets are assets that are liquid items such as cash, marketable securities, And the current asset also includes accounts receivable, which is very important for a healthcare organization. Health receivables are expected to be paid within a year's period of time. Therefore, they are considered current assets. It includes deposits with trustees. The non-current asset or long-term assets includes the biggest one for any organization is the property, plant, and equipment. Funds held in trust, and there are other loans, other assets that are like long-term securities, such as bonds, that kind of thing, are actually part of the non-current assets or long-term assets. So that's the first part of the balance sheet, are the assets. The second part are the liabilities. And just as with the assets, there are current liabilities and non-current liabilities or long-term liabilities. Current liabilities are, of course, accounts payable. Accounts payable includes any wages that have to be paid, any vendors that have to be paid, any deferred revenue. Deferred revenue, a good example of deferred revenue would be, say, for an insurance company. You pay your premium. First month of that premium of the life of that insurance policy, on the insurance company's books, the money that you gave to them minus that first month is considered deferred revenue. It's revenue that has not been earned. So it's considered a liability because that's your money sitting on their books, but they owe you a service or coverage for that money. So it's unearned revenue at that point. Long-term liabilities are fall into the case of bonds that are payable. The part of a bond that's not due in the current year falls under the long-term payable. So it's that bond face value plus any future coupon rates that have to be paid out that are due longer than a year or in a period longer than a year. So the balance sheet has the assets, the liabilities, and the third part is equity. Equity for a nonprofit organization is a little different. Equity for a nonprofit organization includes any monies given to the organization from contributors.
I'm sorry, say that again?
On the balance sheet, there's assets, liabilities, and there's another section called owner's equity. In a not-for-profit organization, the equity section of a balance sheet includes monies given to the organization from contributors. It also includes something called retained earnings. Retained earnings are any earnings retained or any income received or earned by the hospital less expenses. So those are retained earnings. In a for-profit organization, the owner's equity is retained earnings, and it's any monies contributed to the organization by shareholders. So in that owner's equity section for a for-profit organization, when that organization issues stock, and that's different from stocks traded on the market, but when that organization issues stock, those monies are recorded in the owner's equity section of the balance sheet. Okay, the income statement. The income statement includes all revenues. So we're looking at all the revenues that Temple earned over this particular period, which is probably fiscal year 04. So all the revenues that came in are recorded in the income statement. All the expenses that are associated with those revenues are recorded in the income statement. And at the end, you get your gross margin to achieve your net income. So this figure here is the income that Temple University earned in fiscal year 04. So that's all your revenue minus all your expenses. This is the gain. Final statement is cash flow. Cash flow statement includes all cash funds coming in and out of the organization. So all funds derived from operations are up here. As a matter of fact, this number, this is for 05, but for 04, this number is going to come in here. This is the income, the earnings. Then we have all funds coming in and out that are associated with investments. Investing activities. Then we have all funds or cash coming in and out of the organization that are related to financing the organization. Some of the data elements of the income statement we just took a look at. You have your revenue. For healthcare providers, it's mostly, that revenue comes mostly from patient services. For an academic institution, you're also getting revenue from tuition. The expenses are any costs associated with providing that care or any expenses associated with providing teaching services for an academic institution. And that bottom line for the income statement, of course, is net income. This is a note. Charity care can be considered an expense, but it actually is not considered an expense on the income statement. So for most nonprofit organizations and for-profit organizations, charity care is addressed. The amount of money or the amount of capital that was associated with providing that charity care is expressed as well. And it's typically given in a note in the bottom on a section of the income statement. So you will see references to charity care, but you won't see it in the income statement. And there is a cost associated with that, and you will find that in the notes of the income statement. And we went over the balance sheet. So once again, these are the overall, this is the structure of the balance sheet for the most part. We have the assets, the liabilities, and equity. If there are any questions, please feel free to just give me a shout. Okay, and some of those elements on the balance sheet. If you look at some of the long-term assets like plant, equipment, property, they're actually recorded on the balance sheet at cost, even though that value is going to change over time, especially in the case of real estate where real estate actually appreciates over time. They're actually reported on the balance sheet at cost. And if you look on the balance sheet, it'll say it has that value, net value of that particular asset. So it's that value minus any depreciation. And we're not really going to talk about depreciation a lot tonight. It's really straightforward. Depreciation is how you expense capitalized assets. That's the actual asset minus the money that you would expense to the IRS.
A whole accounting class.
So what I'm going to do, I'll send out an addendum to this actual session and include a discussion on depreciation, but pretty much that's what depreciation is. Important concept is accrual accounting. If you look at the income statement, the balance sheet, some of the cash flow items, they're accrual accounting. In other words, if you look at wages on the balance sheet, you'll typically see an account that says wage expense. That is money that's owed to the employees. So let's say October 31st, University of Penn puts out their new income statement. Well, when they put out their income statement on the 31st, which is on a Sunday, they haven't paid their employees for the last half of October. So you, as an employer, you've earned that money, but you don't get paid until November 1st. So on their balance sheet will be an account for accounts payable, and that accounts payable is the money owed to the employees. And that's the concept of accrual accounting. Also, the income statements assume that the organization is a going concern, meaning that's going to continue to conduct business in the future. The cash flow statement, which we touched on, actually converts net income on an accrual basis into cash. It identifies cash flows that are provided from the services and from operating services and from investing and financing activities. And the cash flow statement is really important in the sense that it tells the management, the board of trustees, the shareholders, pretty much gives your cash position to all the stakeholders, which is very important. I mean, if you're not generating enough cash, then in the long run you're not going to be around. The reason why I say that is because when you look on the income statement, you could actually have a significant amount of income, but if you're not generating the same cash flow, then there's an issue. And there's a difference there. And I should point out that that income value, the earnings, is not cash. Exactly, it truly is almost apples and oranges. It's not cash. Because in that net income value, it includes accounts payable. Accounts payable for some organizations could be fairly significant. And if you're not receiving cash from accounts payable in a relatively short period of time, then you're going to run into a cash flow problem. You know, most hospitals are already cash negative. But if you're not receiving that cash in a certain period of time, you're going to run into a serious cash flow problem. And we'll look at that when we look at ratios. Ratio analysis. The data items associated with the financial statements provide us enough information to conduct different types of analysis. One of the most common types of analysis that's performed on the financial statements is ratio analysis. Ratio analysis provides us the tools to evaluate the liquidity position of the organization, evaluate the efficiency of operation, the debt position, and profit position of an organization. For a managed care organization, two relatively important ratios are medical claim ratio and administrative expense ratio. So we have the current ratio. Current ratio is looking at our liquidity position. I'm sorry, was there a question? Our current ratio is looking at our liquidity position with respect to our current assets, short-term assets, and current liabilities. Ideally, the organization would like to have enough cash on hand or liquid assets on hand to service any liabilities that are coming due. So remember, our current assets and our current liabilities are those items that come due or expected to come due within a year. If you're in a situation where your current liabilities are greater than your current assets, then you potentially have an issue. You potentially have a severe negative cash flow problem. The asset test pretty much measures the same thing. However, that numerator is going to be a lot smaller than the total current assets because we're just looking at true liquid assets. So you're looking at your cash, your marketable securities, and your net accounts payable. Collection period. This is our, I'm sorry, I meant to say accounts receivable. Our collection period. Net accounts receivable over the average days, average daily operating revenue. Very important number. This comes down to how quickly does the organization receive the funds due to it from its accounts receivable account. Very important. I mean, every organization should be monitoring this very closely, especially in the healthcare environment. The healthcare environment, more so than anyone else, because you're really beholden to the third-party payer. You know, if it's CMS, they're probably going to pay a lot quicker than some of your insurance companies. But very important ratio and a very important statistic for any organization. Days cash on hand. I've been talking a lot about the importance of making sure the organization has cash by analyzing the cash flow statement. This particular ratio will actually tell you how many days, if everything were to stop and you still had your bills that had to get paid, this particular ratio will tell you how much cash you have on hand to cover all of your operating expenses. Once again, a very important ratio. Some operating ratios. We have net price per discharge. So right now we're looking at the amount of revenue that the organization is receiving per total discharges. Outpatient revenue percent, pretty much the same thing. You're looking at the percent of your outpatient revenue that the organization is receiving relative to total patient service revenue. Occupancy days or percent occupancy. You're looking at you're actually looking at your occupancy rate. I know Penn is typically around 80%, which is pretty much where you want to be. If you have beds that aren't filled, that's like money sitting on the shelf for the most part. So you really want bodies in the bed. So that's actually pretty important for any healthcare organization. If you're in a situation where you're maybe in the 50% range or lower, you're actually, in essence, losing money. there's an opportunity cost associated with empty beds, with those beds. And we'll talk about opportunity costs a little later on.
Well, how are we defining beds there? You know, staff beds. What are you talking
What does that mean?
Staff beds, you know what?
about? Are those the
Meaning
number of
nurses
beds
are
that you're
assigned?
licensed for, the number of beds that you're staffed
Those were actual beds that are available to patients
patients today,
today. Right.
at the moment?
Well,
Well, if you close the unit because your volumes are down and you're not going to staff it, you close the unit until you need it for volume purposes. Would that be included in that number?
You would, but you know why you would close that? You know where you get the information to decide whether or not you're going to close that unit is from this statistic. So if this unit has a really low percentage, that's going to tell management that this particular unit really is, you have staff in there, you're paying the staff, but you're not really filled to a certain target. You're below, wherever your target is, you're below that target.
Yeah, but for my overall hospital occupancy percentage, like I'm going to figure mine out as we speak, but I have units closed. It doesn't take a rocket scientist in my place to figure out how to close a unit because we're small. It's not 1,000 beds and you're wondering what's happening over here and over here. Walk over and you look. So, but that staff beds, is that is that those closed beds too? Because
it's not the closed beds.
I mean,
because they're not staffed at that point. If they were available.
Yeah. So if you close the unit, those are unstaffed.
I'm trying to figure out.
Yeah, that's one of those people out there. I have people on the books for those units that are flex staff. I have them hired.
Available or licensed.
I do.
So that should influence your occupancy.
Because they have by the hour.
It does.
It's not like a closed unit that we said, well, look, we're going to have a staff stream where we laid off staff.
Oh, that's true.
We'll reconsider opening it again in the fall when it's in the spring or vice versa. Versus a unit that you closed today because the census is such in your hospital that you just want to push all the patients over to those 2 units, close the 3rd unit because you really don't have the volume to support all 3 units, so the efficiency is to close one and fill the other 2 up. So I'm wondering if staff beds really means that you have them on the books, that because that would
is it licensed beds in the denominator or no?
Well, then that's the other question, or is it?
Licensed beds versus staff beds.
Well, go ahead and look at this. Your organization, let's say, has 100 beds, 100 staff beds. You decide to close the unit, that takes out 10 staff beds. So when you work out this ratio, those 10 staff beds are no longer part of the computation. So you're only working with 90. Now with the other state, that's another issue. That's an efficiency issue, and that's something that any organization has to think about. I mean, just to take the staff that was initially assigned to that particular unit and lay them off isn't necessarily the best thing to do, because if that staff were to come back up and you have to rehire, there's a cost associated with retraining, even recruiting. So that really comes down to an efficiency issue. If I were looking at that, I would look at the long-term projection. Okay, you have to kind of ask yourself, why is it that we have to close this unit? Well, we didn't have the bodies. Well, do we expect that demand in the future?
Well, now here's what we're dealing with in the Delaware Valley, and they're not having this problem in New York City because I was at a conference there, and they have hospitals there plus 15, it seems. But like in the Delaware Valley, hospitals across the board have seen a decrease in census in a significant way in the last year, say. And so you've seen every system laying off people because of that decrease in census. I'm sure in every hospital, like, say, Abington, who was running an average daily census 500 plus, and now is running an average daily census of 300 or less than 300. And Mainline Health, I don't know what their stat is. My stat was my average daily census was, 92, and now we're at 78. So that's a significant change in your average daily census. So you do lay people off as a result, but that's that occupancy stat that I'm trying to drill down on, because when your census changes over a period of time, you do close units, you do lay off the staff because you have enough of a trend to do it. You don't want to do it, but you have enough of a trend, and you just don't have any of those bodies to go every day anymore. You don't have the supported volume. And we all want to have that crystal ball to say, when's the census going back up, everybody? Because, and where are we going to get that staff back? Because if it happens, that's why that number, to me, that's my question, is my occupancy rate. How's that affected, my percentage, my occupancy number, how's that affected by the fact that I am closing units formally or closing units informally on a day-to-day basis. You know, I have units that are day-to-day. Depends on what the census is. Depends on what happens in my ER tonight, whether that unit will be open or closed tomorrow. Different than closing a unit, staff is dispersed to somewhere else, never to come back until I make a formal.
Right, because that number is
formal
356 days.
Yeah.
So yours doesn't. You'd almost have to do that calculation on a daily basis.
It's divided by, so it's like a per unit kind of deal. So if you take a year ago when the census rate was pretty high, so you would have a certain occupancy rate, say 85%.
Right.
Then today, you're like, okay, for this particular unit or the hospital as a whole, the occupancy rate is like 60%. Well,
per the licensed beds, but per the available beds, you know, the status.
Well, that's the thing. See, and that's when we look at the ratio. The ratio is used to kind of aid in making that decision. So at one point it's 80%. Next point it's 50% or whatever. So that statistic is only aiding to make that decision. Okay, now we're at 50%. What do we do with all these extra beds?
Did you guys define, so it's not licensed beds in the denominator? It's staff beds?
Available staff beds.
That's actually that's a good question. It's actually in here. And I did cover that, but let me make sure. Let me get the exact answer.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, the important part, the real takeaway from any of these statistics is that they're actually used to give management some guidance.
Yes, that's the way you got to hone in on.
Yeah. So once you make a decision that you're going to close a unit, whether you're licensed or staff beds, once you make a decision that you're going to close a particular unit, then they're no longer included in that computation. So, say today, before you close the unit, you're at occupancy rate, say 60%. Tomorrow, you close that unit, and you would have, do the same statistic, your occupancy rate is going to shoot up because you've now, closed those units, closed those beds. Now, with respect to staff's really not included in this at all. It's not really taken into consideration. There are other metrics for that, and I don't think I have any metrics in this slideshow that actually kind of compare staff. But you can compare staff to expenses, to revenue, to patient volume. So those ratios do exist. And what I'll do is I'll include them in the addendum. But in this particular case, this particular metric is only aiding the management to make a certain decision.
Right.
So then that decision is made to close beds. And it could be licensed beds or, with this statistic, I'm not really sure, or it's not really that important how it's really defined. This statistic is looking at beds that could at some point hold a patient that's available for a patient.
So it's a statistic that you could do on a daily basis. I mean, I know we're doing finances and balance sheets, and you're talking about periods of time or overall over a period of a financial year, but this particular statistic is something that you can use for a balance sheet or something you can use for a fiscal year, but also a tool that you can use on a daily basis.
I wouldn't be surprised if your IT system isn't doing that, because the operations management in the hospital is probably looking at that on a regular basis, because you're planning the environmental staff to go in and clean, that kind of thing. So your IT system is probably generating that statistic.
Nick does it, I think, real time.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So because that's the planning statistic too,
I'm going to get my CFO to put that on our dashboard. It's got to be, I'm just thinking it out, for it to be an operationally significant piece of data that you can use to see how efficient you are, it would have to be the number of just available beds at that given moment, and not be closed units kind of thing. Because once it's
correct.
Closed,
right.
formally closed.
And it's not in that statistic one.
Not informally closed, but anything that's available to you, be able to ramp up and staff in 4 hours or something is what you're talking about for that occupancy, because that tells you overall in your facilities how efficient you are.
Right.
The closed are meaningless at some point, because hopefully if you close, say formally, half your hospital for some reason, you're out in rural somewhere and something changed and people on insurance or whatever the reason they're not coming into the hospital, and you were forced to close half of that hospital bed more formally and lay off the staff and hold it. The care staff, you would have had to have operationally changed all the other departments too to reflect the new available bed, and that has to be part of that stat. So I just changed it.
But in a situation that you're talking about at your facility, you could probably come up with an average number of staff beds for like a fiscal year.
Mhm.
If you guys are tracking how many available
Right.
beds you have on a daily basis, you need to average that number and then come up with an occupancy rate for the year.
Right.
And see how you did that way.
That's true. I mean, all these, the ratios that we're looking at here today is a very small number of all the ratios that are available. I mean, you look at all the statistics that you can get from financial statement. You can develop ratios for almost anything.
So let me guess what the questions will be on the test. They'll give you the ratio, and then you have to explain what you would use it for?
I don't think you're going to see that on the test.
What are we doing?
This is a very small part of the test. This
Oh,
actual
thank
section,
God.
and
Not my
it may be 15 questions. Actually, I can actually tell you the number of questions that are on exam that are going to come from this session, and it's not a lot. So, what I'm going to give you today is a lot of detail, but on the surface, it's the stuff you should really kind of hold on to. So, because with ratio analysis, there are a lot, and the ones that I included in this particular presentation are specific to healthcare organizations, and you'll see that as we go on. Well, average length of stay. So we all know that. So we all know how important that is, and you can want it as low as possible, especially with bundling, that kind of thing. Let's look at debt. So the debt analysis pretty much is determining your probability of servicing your debt or how well you're servicing your debt. I mean, that's pretty much for all of them. The one that's really important here for any healthcare organization is the debt to capitalization. This debt to capitalization ratio can actually predict what it will cost for any organization to borrow money. And when we talk about financial management, we'll talk about this discount rate. And this debt to capitalization ratio is pretty important. The debt to capitalization ratio is looking at the amount of debt that comes, say, from bonds, banks, notes, that kind of thing, versus money that comes from equity. Equity for a for-profit organization, remember, is retained earnings, and it's money from shareholders when the organization issues stock. For a not-for-profit organization, that equity comes from contributors, for the most part, endowments, that kind of thing. So you're actually looking at your capital structure. So this debt to capitalization ratio is actually a metric for your capital structure. So your capital structure basically is saying, well, how do we finance our operations? So you look at, you finance it either through long-term debt or equity. Okay. The TAR ratio times interest earned is looking at the ability to pay interest expense for the most part. EBITDA. This EBITDA term is earnings before interest and taxes. So it's looking at, we looked at our net revenue. It's your net revenue minus interest payments and taxes. That's for a for-profit organization. For a not-for-profit organization, it's your net income minus your interest expense. And those are monies that are available to pay interest expense. So that's the interest expense or money due on any bonds or any kind of financial instruments that are rolled out.
Hey, James, I have a question. Are there any ratios, recommended ratios for any of these that you've given out so far, where you should be at any given time?
Yeah, there is. That's a very good question. There's actually industry averages, and the industry averages are published. So for healthcare organizations, hospitals, that kind of thing, you can actually find what the average is in the industry. So you can find one for Philadelphia, and it'll give the average for any of these ratios. And so you'll know how well your organization is doing relative to the industry average. So yeah, that's a good question. The ratios are used to compare against the industry average.
So it would be industry average by region, I guess?
You can find it broken up in many different ways. You can find it by region. You can find it based on the whole country. You can find it by state. But you can find it broken up for Philadelphia. Those averages exist for Philadelphia. So they're out there. I can't tell you exactly where to go for not-for-profit organizations, but they do exist. For for-profit organizations, it's relatively easy. That information is widely available online. But for not-for-profit organizations, they do exist. I do have a source. I don't have it off the top of my head, but I do have a source. And what I will do is I'll get back to you on that.
Great. Thanks.
Who is that, by the way?
Norman.
Norm. Okay, our profit ratios. Profit ratios come down just to finding out how the organization is doing relative to everyone else or just relative to itself on its margins. So our profit margin, we talked about that. You take your net income over your total revenue, and you're looking at the percentage of funds the hospital earned relative to all its income. So the hospital brings in $100 a year. Its net income is 10, so you're earning 10%. So return on assets more directly does so. Using that same example, the hospital will be earning, say, 10% on all its assets. Return on equity, the same concept. It's more important. I'm not going to say it's more important, but it's more typical to look at this particular ratio, this return on equity ratio, in a for-profit situation. In a not-for-profit situation, it's still important because it gives the Board of Trustees and senior management some idea of how the organization is doing relative to its financial position. Managerial accounting. Okay, this is where the rubber kind of hits the road for hospital management. Okay, managerial accounting is primarily used for internal decision making. That's where you're going to look at efficiencies. You're going to look at how well the hospital is doing, how well the hospital is turning over its accounts receivables. Decisions that normally require this kind of information are pricing, capital investment, discontinuance, and sales values. What we talked about earlier with shutting down units, I mean, the data associated that's generated or derived from managerial accounting goes right into answering some of the questions that we just were kind of addressed with related to whether or not we're going to shut down a unit because we're not seeing enough volume through that particular unit. Okay, managerial accounting really gets into the nitty-gritty with cost. So let's kind of get an understanding of cost. For all organizations, there are really two primary types of costs that all organizations actually have. It's fixed costs. Fixed costs, for the most part, is your overhead. The fixed costs are expenses that the organization is going to have to pay, irregardless of anything else happening. I mean, that's your electricity, that's your salaries. In the case of closing down a unit, that overhead that we're talking about here, that's the nurses and the staff that at one point were servicing the beds in that closed unit. You're still paying those salaries. You're still paying that staff. That all comes into your fixed costs. Variable costs. Let's use this example. It's a really good example. Variable costs associated with the beds that are no longer being used. You got 100 beds, and the variable costs associated with those 100 beds would be pharmaceuticals used for those patients, surgical gloves, any kind of surgical equipment that the staff is going to consume when they're servicing those patients. But the moment you close down that unit, the variable cost associated with that particular unit is now zero. You have no more volume coming through that particular unit, so you have no variable costs. So variable costs are directly related to patient volume. The more patient volume you have coming through your hospital, the higher your variable costs. Your fixed costs are there no matter what. That's your overhead. That's your salaries. That's the gas, electricity, heat. I mean, that's always there. So, but your variable costs are associated with patient volume, directly associated with patient volume. Per unit cost is a very important concept as well, and we'll kind of look at that. It should be clear as we go through slides. Okay, critical part of cost measurement is cost allocation. This is a very, I think for anyone who's running a particular department, this is probably a pretty touchy subject. Cost allocation is a process by which the organization allocates costs to certain departments. And costs are not allocated, in most cases, cost is not allocated equally to all departments. The departments, typically your departments that generate the most revenue will see slightly elevated cost numbers. Some examples, ER. I mean, ER generates a lot of costs, but ER probably is not allocated its fair share of cost. Maybe the cardiac department, cardiac services department, big generator of revenue, probably sees a fair share of costs above and beyond. So anybody running the department, that's probably a touchy subject.
And they're doing, and why are we doing that?
Well, hospitals have different reasons for doing it, but there's a couple of ways to look at it. It's all hospitals, all departments operate off of a budget. You put your budget together at the beginning of the year, and there's some goals associated with that. And I'm not going to say for reasons of efficiency, but when it comes down to allocating those costs are just not allocated equally. In a sense, because you really don't know. If you look at gas, the heating, the whole hospital, how do you really determine what percentage of what part of that gas goes to what department? So there's a lot of flexibility in doing that. And organizations choose to allocate most of that cost to your high revenue departments.
Or not.
Or not. I mean, but if you look at your most hospitals, like Penn, if you look at it, I mean, Penn has a big ER. Look at their ER, but they're even CHOP. With respect to overhead costs, they're probably not truly being sharing that total.
Reflected appropriately.
It's not really.
Yeah, I have an example actually with Penn Medicine. With respect to, I guess, within my world, we have a hospital University of Pennsylvania entity, but then we also have a physician practice entity, clinical practices University of Pennsylvania. And they, I know it's been in probably the past several years, it hasn't always been the case just because it was a bit of a nightmare to determine the allocation. It was kind of a pain in the butt to do it, I guess, and they weren't doing it previously. But now that the costs have gone up quite a bit, they want to match the expense to the revenue coming in. So that the physician practices earn a lot of revenue from using our diagnostic imaging equipment for tests. So they actually collect revenue specific to the practice. And in years past, they never were allocated then the maintenance and service of the diagnostic imaging equipment, which is fairly expensive. So and it's a kind of a new process in the past maybe 2 or 3 years, but there was a decision made to create then the accounting infrastructure to do allocation, get some agreement across both parties what's a reasonable way to do that administratively. Because you really, from an invoicing perspective, you can really link it back to the home department and match revenue with expense. But in the past, it wasn't always done. That's why I said you could do it, you could allocate, or you might not. And another example where we don't allocate cost is on the hospital basis, which is also within my world with respect to municipal waste and regulated medical waste disposal. Obviously, there's an expense associated with that, but at this point, there's no easy way operationally to uniquely tag and identify municipal waste pounds to a specific department or accounting unit. Regulated medical waste, which is far more expensive, there is barcoding technology that we can use now, so we're actually considering that for the future so that each business unit has to be much more judicious in their resource in terms of segregating waste stream appropriately and that kind of thing. So from a cost allocation perspective, I guess that's just one example of what we've done.
I think that's a great example, and that's actually the crux of the problem. Variable costs are somewhat easier to allocate. So for any department, any variable costs that are incurred in any department, I mean, that's fairly easy to allocate that.
Right.
But it's the fixed cost, like you mentioned, the actual medical waste issue. I mean, that for the most part is going to be, that can go both ways. I mean,
variable by weight. It's weight dependent. But then there's another allocation that was done recently, again with the physician practices, which usually was kind of subsumed in the hospital operations, but they were never charged rent, like a rent allocation for, like you said, these costs of overhead and utilities and that kind of thing. But Penn went through a pretty comprehensive square foot analysis of all the different clinical practices space and determined, again, has to get some consensus on what's the calculation methodology of allocating rent. Because again, in terms of day-to-day accounting, as a business unit or practice or department, perhaps you appear like you are much more financially prudent, but then all of a sudden you're like, well, you never realized the rent expense for many, many years, and that was clouding the financial picture. You know, so we started doing that also. But that's a rent allocation. That was
when they did all this, did it go over well? Did everybody?
No, but you know.
Well, that's the problem. That's the problem.
But that's trying to. I guess that was Penn's attempt really to put the onus on that department head to manage expenses well, and then subsequently, obviously, you know, the waste discussion, regulated medical waste is our most expensive waste stream, and if as a department head operationally, I essentially bear that expense on behalf of the campus, so no one ever sees it except for me. So why do I care? We do waste audits and we find 50 pounds, and I'm exaggerating, butter cookie tins in red bag trash, and it's our most expensive waste stream. But if you, in fact, were the manager, you would be more of a partner in trying to educate your staff about how to segregate safely and appropriately to mitigate that expense, because then your unit has to bear that expense now. So. Anyway.
Good point, but that's what makes it tough. I mean, if your unit is being charged a certain expense, you know.
It happened with medical supplies. Medical supplies previously at HUP were essentially borne expense by materials management, and probably in the past, I guess 5 or 6 years, it became a departmental allocation. So the supplies are uniquely tagged to a specific unit.
And that
specific unit is wasteful.
Check the barcode.
Barcode scan, yeah. But if a unit is kind of wasteful, or they're bringing a lot of product into an isolation room and then it's getting contaminated and has to be discarded, if you chose to bring 100 products into the room, the onus again is on that department unit manager to manage the expenses better. So.
That's such a great example. I mean, you look at it before they did the barcoding. Before they did the barcoding, it's a fixed expense. You don't know where the waste is coming from. So at that point, it's a fixed expense. It has to be distributed across the entire university, you know, different departments, the entire hospital, different departments. So how do you allocate it to different departments? At some point, somebody came up with an actual mechanism to allocate it to different departments. It probably wasn't fair. So now it's barcoded. The moment you barcode it, you know exactly where it's coming from. It goes from becoming a fixed expense to a variable expense. Because that waste is generated based on, should be, patient volume. An example of throwing in cookie tins and stuff, that's not patient volume, but ideally, it's based off of patient volume. The more patients coming through a certain department, the more medical waste you're going to generate. So as soon as you guys did that, it went from being a fixed expense that's kind of spread out across the entire organization to a variable expense where it's associated with patient volume and it's associated directly to that department. So that was an excellent example. I mean, I kind of brought in everything in one example. That was great.
Reins get tighter on healthcare. They'll be measuring how much heat you use and everything else.
There's going to be more of these discussions. Exactly.
They're going to come up with more and more ways of really how to track variable costs down to the unit level. You know, and in some situations it requires technology, but you do a return on investment. You know, I'm sure that as soon as they put in the barcoding for both your red bag trash and your supplies, they probably saw an overall dramatic decrease in how much money was going out in buying these supplies. You know, so you do a return on investment. Look at that. Technology costs money, but can also save you money.
Yeah, return.
Well, more of that when I do my presentation.
Right.
But keep that example because we're going to look at some about how we evaluate those kinds of things. Keep that example so we can maybe use that. So that's the issue with allocating costs. I mean, we just kind of talked about it. And there's a couple of methods that hospitals use to go about this. The direct method is kind of what Mia was kind of talking about with the medical waste. And there are some other methods, and then we have this reciprocal method, which is, in a sense, it's a real arduous task to get it all figured out, especially without, you know, some decent software. But nevertheless, there are methods to determine how cost is allocated. And once again, this goes back to Mia's example. Keep in mind that the primary goal of cost allocation is to allocate costs to services or departments that create the need for cost, that actually generate that cost. However, in order for it to be effective, the cost drivers must meet two tests. The first is that a good system must be fair. So if we go back to the medical waste example, now we can say with some certainty that it's fair because it's tagged. You know which department it's coming from. Before, it really wasn't fair. We had all this medical waste. It cost X number of dollars. We got to allocate it across all the departments. You know, everyone being charged the right amount or a fair amount. So it must be fair. With the bar coding system, we can now say it's fair. Second, the system must foster cost reduction. We're just talking about that as well. Brian had the same example. You bring this technology. You know, people are now aware of what departments are throwing away, what the weight is, how much waste is in there. Waste in the sense that it shouldn't be in a red bag. So it should drive cost reduction within the organization as well. So great examples.
First month though, you got to put a lot of stuff in the red bags. So that you got something to work with and show reduction.
That you're improving. Try a bunch of those cookie butter tins.
That's right.
And that, I was exaggerating on the weight, but that was an actual red bag trash audit we did. And the explanation, and it was, you know, it's just an educational thing, but I think the support associate on the patient care unit was saying, well, but it was in the isolation room. And I'm like, well, did you rub the cookies in the wound? Okay.
Yeah.
But it was just an educational thing. It was really, should have been in the municipal stream.
In the bed with the patient, leave the cookies.
But the guy picked it up and showed her, and she's like, I didn't know that. I'm like, all right.
But it's good. But you know, at the end, you got that end result. You got that cost reduction.
Right.
You know, which is in today's healthcare environment. I mean, we're going to see more and more of that. So that's really going to be.
Yeah, we're not actually doing a cost allocation. We're just collecting data right now, because in the equitable, fair, mitigating cultural shock, we're just going to share data out to the organization because people have to get, you know, comfortable with the fact that, oh my goodness, those are my weights, and then try to, work with their group to figure out how are we going to make sure that we get the education out and the practices and behavior out prior to then having an effective date for the allocation, so that people have the opportunity to change their wicked ways.
It's a motivator, isn't it? It's a motivator.
You also don't know what to allocate to the departments either without at least a half a year's worth of data, so you can estimate, projector and year.
Yeah, it's actually all by weight, priced by weight. So,
I know, but I'm saying that you can't say that his department is going to bear the burden of this percentage of the bill until you really allocate it to see if it's his department or my department that's generating more weight, so you can allocate it to our variable costs when budgeting purposes. If you're going to give me $1 million to operate my department this year, you know, and you break down my budget, you know, and 20,000 of that is
you have to have historical data to
in order to properly budget
in your
over a
budget.
period of time.
Absolutely.
Great discussion, guys. Okay, we're talking about cost. So let's kind of look at our cost curve here. So we can get a better idea of how the fixed costs and variable costs kind of work. Well, your fixed costs are your overhead. I mean, that really, for the most part, doesn't really change. I mean, in real life, yeah, it's seasonal, depending on how things, the weather, how you use the heat, air conditioning, that kind of thing, electricity. But for the most part, your fixed costs within a certain range do not change. Your variable costs are directly related to patient volume. The more patients you have, the more variable costs you have. And your total cost. So the total cost on the hospital is just the sum of the fixed costs and variable costs. Let's take a look at the cost-profit relationship. So in terms of revenues and how it relates to cost. It's actually pretty interesting. Look at a fee-for-service model. So, you know, and I know in the healthcare institution it's not one or the other for the most part. I mean, in some cases it is, depending on the type of care that's being provided, but for the most part I know it's a mix of a bunch of different models. But in a fee-for-service model, your actual total cost is the red line. The patient volume and thus your revenue is the black line. And what this graph is actually telling us is that until we reach this point, which is roughly 120 patients, okay, until we reach this point, the hospital has not made a profit. So you're actually operating at a loss. So until you reach 100 20 patients. So you have your fixed costs, you have your variable costs, and until you reach a certain volume target or a certain volume number in patients, you're actually operating at a loss. So in the case of a fee-for-service model, your profit is all up here. This is the organization's profit. So if you're looking at trying to make your organization more efficient, what you want to do is drive down costs. So you want to drive down your variable costs. So you actually want to change the slope of that line. So there's not a whole lot you can do with the fixed. I mean, there is, but there's not really a whole lot you can do with fixed costs unless you actually shut down a whole unit or a number of whole units. But for the most part, when you're focusing on becoming more efficient, your attention is paid to variable costs. Let's look at it under a capitation model. The profit's totally on the other side of the curve. In the capitation model, it's pretty interesting. You're paid based on the number of folks that are in a certain health plan. I mean, that's a fixed revenue that you're going to receive. And everything comes down to that point to patient visits. So in this particular case, this is the total revenue. It's fixed. If it's only for straight capitation, it's a fixed value that you're receiving that year. This is your total cost. And in this particular case, all your profit is over here. So once you reach that point of 80 visits, once you're beyond 80 visits, let's say, you're actually operating at a loss. So under this model, all your profits here. So if you get 20 visits, typically in a given year, you're making a pretty decent profit. So it's all coming here. So you really see that in primary care or primary care physician. So I mean, in reality, your primary care physician is probably getting paid a certain value based on X number of patients he's getting at month in, month out. If you're the patient that's going 2-3 times a month, well, in the long run, and this is the reality of how it is, he's actually going to lose money on that particular patient. So, and in many cases, once you start going beyond a certain period of time, the insurance company actually gets involved to where you have to pay out of pocket, more out of pocket. So looking at this relationship with cost and profit, you're seeing profit on both two separate sides of the curve. In the fee-for-service, the more volume you have, the more profit you make under the capitation model. It's actually the opposite. Okay, contribution margin. Contribution margin basically is used for a cost volume analysis. So it goes back to number of patients coming through the organization. So, and what we're trying to determine is if you're looking at in this particular case, we're looking at a projected P&L statement for, let's say, a unit that closed down at Roxborough. Now they're going to open this unit back up. The management wants to know how much do we have to, or how many patients do we have to bring through this particular unit in order just to cover fixed costs. From an economic point of view, an economic analysis, if you can cover fixed costs, you should remain open. So if a department, at the very least, is covering all of its fixed costs, it should remain open. So when you look at contribution margin, that's exactly what we're looking at. We want to know how many patients we have to flow through this particular unit in order for the unit to cover all of its fixed costs. So once you reach that actual number, then the unit is bringing in all profit from that point of view. Any questions?
What's MC?
MC is contribution margin. Oh, it should be MC. I'm sorry, that should be CM.
Oh, okay.
Typo I didn't catch.
Oh, okay.
Like I said, I did all this today. So I started at 6 o'clock this morning.
Got it.
But yeah, that should be contribution margin.
Okay.
So the total contribution margin is, in this example, is the $5 million. Is a dollar amount per visit to cover allocated fixed costs? That doesn't make sense to me.
Let's go through it. The total margin, the total revenue, that's the total number of patients plus, say, some fixed costs that unit's going to charge each patient. Okay? You're looking at volume, so your cost you're looking at, for the most part, is your variable cost, because variable cost is tied directly to patient volume.
Right.
So you take your the total cost, your patient volume, and the difference is your contribution margin. That contribution margin is the contribution going towards fixed costs. So you got your 7 million minus 2 million, you got your 5 million. This is your fixed cost. So you take out the fixed cost, this is profit. So this 5 million is contributed to your fixed cost. That's what you're trying to figure out. So you know this particular unit, after we did all of our cost allocation, this unit is going to open up. This is our projected cost allocation. This is what it's going to cost to run this unit, whether we have anybody or we have 100 people. This is our fixed cost. This is the salaries. This is the heat that's allocated to it. You know, that
The 5 million?
No. The,
Jerome?
That should be 7 million. That should be a comma. I'm sorry. That should be 7 million.
And Jerome, this Norman.
Yes, Norman.
128. Shouldn't it be 7182? Didn't we subtract the 2818 from the 100? Is that how you calculate it?
Yeah, you're right too. Yeah.
So what is it?
It's the difference between 100 and 2818.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Kind of bear with me. Like I said, I did all this today. It was kind of a rush kind of deal, and I went over and I tried to catch all the typos, but.
No, as long as you know what you were talking about, no, this is a good model.
Yeah, that total, that contribution margin, that actual value here, that's the difference between the revenue and the cost. So that's actually the difference between these two.
Oh, the 7128 is what you should be charging per patient.
No, we're actually charging $100 per patient. $28 is the cost per patient. That's the variable cost per patient. So what is the profit from each patient is $71. So for each patient that comes through, the hospital has a gain of $71.
Not including your indirect costs.
Correct.
So not necessarily. You said profit, not contribution margin.
But it's the variable cost. It's the cost. So if someone's coming through a MRI machine, any cost associated with that MRI, that includes the maintenance and that kind of stuff for the MRI, whatever equipment is used for the MRI, comes into variable costs. Yeah. So the difference between the money that you're going to get from that patient, the patient pays $100 for, or the insurance company pays $100 for that service. The cost associated with that particular service, that one person coming through on a per unit basis, is $28. The profit on a per unit basis is $71.
In the contribution margin.
To the contribution margin, right? That's the contribution margin.
I guess the point I was just making, contribution margin is different than profit in terms of accounting terms.
No, it's well.
Yes.
Profit margin includes fixed expense as well. So
yes.
Fixed cost.
So there's a difference.
There is a difference.
That's
because
what I'm saying, yeah.
the contribution in the profit margin, the cost number is going to be a lot larger because it's going to include all your fixed costs.
Your indirect, correct.
Your indirects, correct. So in this case, we're just looking at the variable cost because what we're trying to do is evaluate whether or not we're going to be able to cover our fixed costs if we open up this unit. So if we open up this unit, this is how much we expect. This is the estimate. This is what we expect to earn off of each patient. This is what it's going to cost when each patient comes through. That's the variable cost. It's not the fixed cost. That's just the cost associated with that patient coming through. And that goes down to surgical supplies, any equipment that's needed to keep the machine running, that kind of thing. So you have the cost, the profit or the revenue derived from that patient. The patient comes through, you receive $100. There's a cost associated for the services that patient's going to receive in this particular unit. That's the variable cost. The difference is your contribution margin, which is like your net profit or your profit margin, but it's like it, but it's not because it doesn't include the other costs. So your contribution margin is what's going to be contributed to, that's going to contribute to the fixed cost. Because in order to, the decision as to whether or not you're going to open a unit or keep the unit open comes down to covering fixed costs. That's, in a strict sense of the word, it comes down to. I'm ignoring like cost.
No, I'm making the whole point. I was just trying to clarify that contribution. There's a difference between contribution margin and profit. So
there is because profit is.
No, I'm with you. I get you.
Okay.
I get you.
Okay.
Where does the 75,000 come from? Where does that term come from?
That's the number of patients. That's that's just an estimate.
Oh, it's just an estimate. You're just saying on average we think maybe 75,000. I guess what I'm trying to figure out is that how do you determine what the margin is? you just keep throwing in a different number? Like today we use 75, but how do we identify that we need to see X number of patients? I guess you just remove the 75 and put an X in there and do the math, right?
Yeah, so
To come up with X number of patients. We need to know if we have to see exactly 7,221 patients in order to be able to break even.
how we did, yep. And
So we just do simple algebra?
Basically.
There?
You do. You actually work backwards. So you have a pretty good idea of what your fixed cost is going to be. So to open this unit, you run this unit year to year, we have a pretty good idea. We don't know with 100% certainty, but we have a pretty good idea that it's going to be $4.9 million a year in fixed costs.
Based on about 75,000 people.
Well, no, fixed costs are different. The fixed costs are the costs.
That's right. I'm sorry. You're right. Fixed costs. All right. I'm thinking about variable. But the variable varies with. Well, that's a terrible math problem there that we have to calculate. If you substitute 75,000, if you substitute X for 75,000, to do that math equation will constantly be unsolvable because the variable cost is directly related to X. So I don't think you could ever actually solve that problem, right?
You can. Yeah, and if you like, I can actually show you on Excel because think of your fixed cost as a target. That's just a target.
Yeah.
Say
we shouldn't waste our time for this group. Though.
No, it's good. I think.
The math, but
I think it's actually good.
if I get the math, I understand what you're trying to show me.
Okay, I can tell you in about 4 or 5 sentences. The fixed cost is a target. Let's say your fixed cost is $100. To run this unit is $100. And you're asking yourself, how many people do I have to see in order to break even? That's it. So you know what you're going to charge. You know that already. You know you're going to charge $100. Or
so the payer will pay.
Right. And you know that every time somebody comes through, if I run this machine, even if I go and evaluate this machine, I know that the technician's going to have to wear gloves. She's going to have to do this. She's going to have to do that. So just for the patient coming through, you know the technician's going to have to do certain things that are going to generate an expense. So,
so each patient has an expense, but the variable cost is driven by, multiply that by the number of patients,
correct.
And that's what increases your variable
correct.
cost.
Exactly. Yeah,
Okay.
that's it. So in Excel, you just have a whole column set, and you graph it, and you can see the line, and basically you look at the graph and you see where your break-even point is. So you can do that algebraically as well. So.
But this is for a fee-based system.
No, because no matter what you do in a healthcare institution, you're receiving some kind of some money.
But in a capitation system, not so much?
Same thing. In the capitation system, you still have your fixed cost target, right? And if so many patients come through, that they're still going to generate a certain revenue from that. Because your revenue, think of your revenue, you can build revenue.
You can build for that above and beyond in the capitation. If you're given X number of dollars to pay to take care of somebody for a year, the less services you use, like an HMO, the less services you use, the more money you get to keep.
And that's correct. But from a management point of view, you're going to say, okay, this is what we expect to pay. Like in all hospitals, the price for what hospitals charge is not really what they get. I don't think in any case.
Never.
You work for the VA, so I'm not sure how it works in the VA, but like the University of Penn Temple, you look on your bill, there's a certain charge, but they don't get that. Yeah, they don't get anywhere near that. So, but nevertheless, that revenue has to be based off of either what they expect to get, and this is an internal accounting issue. It has to be based on what they expect to get from that service times the volume they want to break even. Because from hospital management's point of view, you still have to overall, have to have some kind of profit. If it's not bringing enough money to cover expenses, then that's it. So they're just looking at this particular unit. They want to know how many patients have to come through this unit in order for this unit to be profitable. And they define profitable. Ideally, you want to cover costs. Costs are, in any healthcare system, costs really drive payment, basically. So you want to be able to cover costs. So that's true in for-profit organizations and not-for-profit organizations. And going forward, I'm going to try to dig up information and see how the VA does stuff, because the VA is getting paid directly from the government. So I'm not sure how the negotiations
We're just getting
take
a
place.
flat budget.
That's how it works. Yeah. But internally, when you're looking at this process internally, you have to have some kind of idea of whether or not you're going to open this unit. If you're doing the analysis and you come back and say, you know what, the most that we could possibly see in this particular unit is 50,000 people, well, then you have to figure out what your contribution margin is going to be if you're only going to see 50,000 people. You know, if it doesn't cover fixed costs, then you have to make some decisions as to whether or not you're going to open this unit. And hospitals don't operate purely on that whole cost structure. I mean, a hospital will operate and not cover fixed costs. Like they will operate a unit and don't cover fixed costs. You know, especially not-for-profit organizations, because it's the right thing to do, and that's where cost shifting and stuff takes place. And a good example is most emergency rooms. You know, most emergency rooms do not generate a profit at all. You know, I mean, on the front end, a lot of times you probably miss out on that patient contribution to deductible, you know, for the insurance. But I mean, most emergency rooms do not make a profit at all.
But if you're grabbing that money, because a lot of in the for-profits where we work aggressively to get that money on the front end, is that going back to the ED or is that going into somewhere else in the world of the financial allocation?
That money comes in?
Yeah.
Internally it probably is going to the budget. It's probably going to the ER budget. But in the for-profit world, you have a lot more people looking at your expenses. In the for-profit world, you have a lot of aggressive Wall Streeters looking at it. Because in the for-profit world, in order for people to invest in your hospital, you have to be efficient. You have to turn a profit.
You have to get that money.
Right. That's right. And I guess like in Tenet's case, I mean, they're probably more you know, efficient, really driven to reduce costs.
Yeah, I mean, I was blown away by it because, you know, being on the clinical side, I was slightly offended by the fact that we were bonusing those employees for the amount of money they were able to collect.
Right.
You know, on the front end there at you know, registration, whether it was in the ED or whether it was registering for any service.
Copay. Great.
Yeah. And it's tons of money that you leave on the table that you never see.
Right.
You just never see it. But I thought, well, wait a minute, if that's their job, I'm not, you know, bonusing my nurses because we didn't have inspections on the unit this month. That's their job.
You may see
know,
that
but
down.
the inspections cost a ton of money
right.
if they're not doing it well.
You know what?
If
You'll see that next time.
the registrar's not doing it well and not getting the money, oops, I forgot to ask. And that's why people don't pay. Oops, I forgot to ask. I mean, certainly there's those that don't have it. And then you've got to worry about that. But if you know, here's a credit card thing, here's the ATM right there, and they make it so easy.
Yeah.
Just cough up the bucks if you have it. But that's the for-profit world. They got their own bonus.
Well, there is that difference between the for-profit and not-for-profit, but
See what they were thinking.
for the next few years, the not-for-profit organizations are going to become just as efficient.
Yeah, yeah.
They have to be.
Yeah.
So. Okay, let's look at budgeting. Okay, the budget should accomplish a few things. It should control the activities of the organization, coordinate activities, and communicate important objectives, and motivate personnel. We were talking about the for-profit world. I mean, this is where some of that comes in. Budgeting involves detailed plans in dollar terms that specify how resources are to be obtained and used over a specific period of time. And your budget, like we were looking here, what we were looking at before, the contribution margin, that's actually part of a budget analysis, and it's based off of revenue and cost estimates. So we don't know for certain what the costs are going to be. We don't know for certain what the revenues are going to be. So you actually estimate those. And there are ways to estimate that, and if anybody send me an email, I can send you some stuff on it. So there are different types of budgets. You have the incremental budget. That's actually the easiest. The incremental budget starts off, and if you run a department, this is probably something that you do on a regular basis, but your incremental budget starts with last year's budget, and you make changes based off of, the economic environment, inflation, so you increase by 2% certain items. Whether or not you're going to open up a new unit, so that's your incremental budget. You start from last year's budget as a starting point, make small changes, and that's your budget for this year. Easiest budget to do. Zero-based budget. 5%. If you're a budget manager, the zero-based budget is probably a pain in your side because it starts from scratch. Yeah. And the zero-based budget requires you to justify your budget items. Whether they were there last year or going to be there this year, you have to justify those budget items. Then you have the standard cost budget, which relies on cost analysis, and it comes down to how accurate are estimated costs. Then you have the program budget, and to be totally honest with you, I really couldn't find anything in any text on the on the program budget. There is a very small blurb in the manual, in the BOG reference manual, but it wasn't really clear to me based on what it said. I mean, output, program, cost benefit analysis. So I really couldn't find a whole lot on it. And there are actually other methods to develop a budget, but these are the most prominent.
I have to take off. I'm sorry. I got to be somewhere else at 8. So I'm sorry. Are these normally scheduled 7:30 or 8 or kind of whenever?
No, I'm trying to get them through in an hour, and I knew this was going to be kind of okay.
All right.
But we have about 6 or 7 more slides, and then we're done.
Yeah, that's approximate, but okay. Thanks, guys.
Okay, financial management. Financial management deals with capital requirements of the organization. Comes down to looking at a few things: the cost of standing business, the cost of doing business, the cost of changing businesses. We talked about that in some detail. You know, whether or not we're going to open a unit, close a unit. That's all involved in financial management. And the returns of supplies of capital. There's some key concepts and terms that you probably should look over. Cost accounting, the break-even issue. Some big ones are, a real big one really is opportunity cost, understanding opportunity cost. That's a really big issue when you're evaluating different programs or initiatives to take on. And sunk cost. So those are some things you should probably read over. I'll probably add some things to the addendum, so you can look over that as well. Okay, financing the operations. Big deal. We kind of talked about it briefly when we looked at the debt to capitalization ratio. But there are 2 ways to finance your operations in the organization, and they are the use of equity financing and debt financing. It's a little bit different for the for-profit world and the not-for-profit world. So equity financing, let's look at it from the point of view of the for-profit world. The for-profit world, equity financing comes from the shareholders. Okay, an organization issues stock, and an organization's issuance of stock is different from stock bought on the exchange. And we don't have to go into great detail, but nevertheless, an organization issues stock. The stockholders give the organization money for that share. That money goes into equity, contributed earnings. Then you have retained earnings. Retained earnings are the monies that the organization earns on its operation. So that's your net income. That net income that comes in on your income statement minus any dividends that are paid out. In the not-for-profit world, your equity primarily is contributions and retained earnings. Then you can finance using debt. There's short-term debt, long-term debt. Short-term debt is considered trade credit. When you buy something from a hospital supplier or vendor, that vendor gives you 30 days to pay. That's actually short-term debt. That's trade credit. So that was, well, there's actually a benefit to that, and most of your big organizations stretch that out. Walmart probably stretched that out to their vendors. Any big organization. IBM stretches that out to their vendors, and that's a working capital issue. You know, the smaller your working capital, the more money that you have for doing other things. I mean, you want to really lessen your working capital. If you have a large requirement for working capital, you can, especially for a hospital, you can run into some cash flow issues. And I wish I had more time to talk about that because that's a really important issue for most hospitals. So you want to kind of stretch out those credit terms. And for a large organization, if you can stretch it out without damaging your relationship with the vendor, do it because it has a positive impact. You know, it's not like an individual who doesn't pay their car note or something like that. It's different for an organization. Because you're dealing with net working capital, very important issue. The other one is long-term notes, which is you can finance using bonds. A lot of hospitals issue bonds, that kind of thing. That's long-term. And we talked about the debt to capitalization ratio. This whole sourcing or sources of finance or sources of financing comes down to an organization's capital structure. And typically, a capital structure is the target that the CFO tries to hit. You know, and the big benefit of the capital structure comes down to some of the credit terms we're talking about. And it also comes down to the ability to get financing on the market, additional financing on the market. It comes down to your cost of capital. Okay, so capital investment decisions. A few decisions you can look at is whether or not to buy new equipment, whether or not to hire more folks, whether or not you want to go out to the market and get some interest-bearing bonds to finance different things, whether or not you want to repurchase debt. which does occur. That would occur if interest rates were to go up. When interest rates go up, the price of bonds goes down, and in many cases, it's worth the organization to go out and repurchase that debt because the amount of money that they would have in the long run is less because the price of the bond goes down. So in other words, an organization issues bonds for $1,000. The interest rate goes up, say 2 years from now. Now the price of that bond trades for, say, $160. They buy it back at $160. The difference is savings. That's money that they, cost avoidance. And looking at different programs, close a unit, keep a unit open. So the input for those decisions are the most important, by far the most important input is cash flows. Cash flows are the money that that particular initiative will earn over the lifetime of that particular program. So you open up a new unit, how much money are we going to earn from this unit over time? Economic life, how long is this unit or process or piece of equipment going to be viable? The discount rate. The discount rate is determined by a number of different things. Primarily, it's determined by an organization's cost of capital. That goes back to the capital structure. But there are also issues that you have to consider when you look at the discount rate. It could be based off of the riskiness associated with a certain program. You decide to open up a new program or buy a new piece of equipment for your organization. If breaking even is going to be somewhat difficult, meaning that there's more risk that you may not break even over a certain period of time, then that's going to increase the risk associated with it and increase the discount rate. Discount rate and interest rate. Then you have the impact of taxation or cost-related reimbursement. Taxation is not really an issue for the not-for-profit, but it is for the profit world. And cost-based reimbursements is something that the finance folks at hospitals worry about on a regular basis, dealing with your third-party reimbursement. So if you're going to open up a new piece of equipment, you're going to say, okay, I'm going to open up this new unit. I got this new piece of equipment, like University of Pennsylvania has nuclear medicine. Chances are that before they move forward, undertook that initiative, they probably had some discussions with third-party payers. Are they going to pay? Right. Because you open up this new equipment, the third-party payers are not going to pay for it. So then you're sitting on this piece of equipment that's not earning any income. All right, so we're going to make this decision. Okay, we're going to, Penn is going to say, okay, we want to look at this nuclear medicine program. Should we invest in it? Is this something that we want to do at University of Pennsylvania? University of Pennsylvania is going to take a look at what it costs to set it up. What it costs to set it up is the investment cost. That's what's going to cost today to set it up. University of Pennsylvania then is going to say, in 1 year, I think we're going to earn $200 from this particular process, this particular new treatment. In year 2, we're going to earn $500. In year 3, we're going to earn $1,200. Now, just for the point of this example, we're going to stop at year 3, but it can go on until the useful life of the equipment, which I'm not sure it will be within the medicine case, but it might be 15 years, 12 years, 15 years. Okay, so these are the estimated cash flows. $200 in year 1, $500 year 2, $1,200 year 3. Now, remember, they're estimated cash flows. We don't know for certain what they're going to be, but we have a pretty good idea. This is what we're going to earn in cash flows off of this equipment because of the number of population who suffers from this particular condition, number of those patients we can expect to come through our institution. So you're going to say, okay, we have that. The next thing we need to do before we decide as to whether or not we're going to invest in this project is determine what the discounted cash flows are. The discounted cash flows are the cash flows that you're getting in the future based on the discount rate. The discount rate is the interest rate that you can get. It's a couple of ways to look at it. The cost of capital is one. It could be the cost of capital if you decide to use that. It could be the rate of return that you would get if you, instead of going with nuclear medicine, you went with another pulmonary center. What's the risk associated with that? What's the rate of return associated with that? So that's the discount rate. So the discount rate is the cash flow divided by the discount rate to the power of a given year. I'm not going to bore you with the math. But in other words, you get a discounted cash flow. The sum of all your discounted cash flows, your outflows, which is your investment, your cash flows, the discounted cash flows derived from this new procedure gives you what is called the net present value. If the net present value is positive, that is saying that there is some future benefit derived from this process. And we're not talking about whether it's 1,000 or 400, 500. It could be 2. Even if it's $2, there's still some economic benefit. The organization is generating some wealth from this project. That's really the gist of it. and I really should have spent more time on net present value. What we're talking about net present value is the time value of money. $1 today is worth more or worth less than $1 a year from now. Because that dollar you have today, if you put it in a bank and there's some interest, it's going to be worth $1.03, or maybe $1.01 or whatever. So the net present value evaluation is based off the time value of money, and that means basically that $1 today is worth less, worth more in the future. So you have to take that into consideration when we discount the cash flows. Or worth less, I'm sorry. $1 today is worth less in the future. It's worth less if it's not invested. So if you have that dollar in your pocket and you hold it in your pocket, a year from now it's worth less than $1 tomorrow, a year from now, 2 years from now. And those are your discounted cash flows. So just to reiterate, the net present value evaluation technique, and the net present value technique is by far the best technique to use because you're looking at true cash. You're not looking at percentages. You're looking at true cash. So of all the techniques that you may use to evaluate a future project, net present value is by far the best. I went over that kind of quickly, but are there any questions?
No, and I don't even want to throw this out there. I just had,
I understand.
this was a beast, so you missed the conversation. Did you talk about depreciation in there? Is there?
I didn't. There'd be any addendum. I can talk about it real quickly. Depreciation.
No, it just seems like it's always part of the financier's language.
Depreciation. If you
Hello?
Sorry, I had it on mute there.
Ron, are you back?
Yeah, I was on mute and I was talking, but I couldn't get it. I forgot to push the mute button. You still there, Jerry?
Hello?
Hey, you still there?
I don't know. I think we might have lost them.
Yeah, I think we lost
okay.
him. All right. See y'all in a few weeks.
All right, be well.
You too.
Yeah, hi. Jerry, you're on mute. Oh. Oh, okay. Okay.
Frank is still here. Norm is still here.
Yes, I think somebody had to leave. I don't remember.
Okay.
Is that Norm?
Yeah.
Hello.
Well, Frank, you still on?
Might just be Norm then.
Okay, there's only one more slide, so I'll go over the one more slide. If you're muted, I'll just go over this real quickly.
I don't know. Nobody said anything.
Okay, there's another evaluation technique that's used quite a bit. Although I want to reiterate, the net present value technique is by far the best. I mean, that's because you're dealing with actual cash. And if your estimates are really good, then it's by far the best. The other one that's used fairly frequently is the internal rate of return. The internal rate, this is the same example, but the internal rate of return, in a nutshell, is saying if project earns a return greater than the discount rate, and that discount rate could be the cost of capital, that could be the risk associated with the project, then you should accept the project. You should undertake that project. In this particular case, our cash flows can be significantly lower, and if we get the cash flows that are shown under our discounted cash flows, if we generate these cash flows, which are a lot less than our net present value estimate, then we should still undertake the project because the actual internal rate of return for this particular project is close to 30%. So that's it. So in the net present value, just to kind of sum it all up, it's really important. It may be on the exam. Net present value determines all your cash flows. If the net present value, which is the sum of all your cash flows, if it's positive, you should go ahead and undertake the project. If it's positive, undertake the project. If it's negative, do not undertake the project because you're actually losing money. Internal rate of return. If the internal rate of return of a certain project is greater than your discount rate could be your cost of capital. And there's a way to figure that out, and I'll include that in the addendum. That's the weighted actual cost of capital. Or the discount rate associated with the project. You'll only use that if the project is fairly risky because it's going to be higher than the cost of capital. So if your internal rate of return is higher than your discount rate, you should accept the project. Now, there's one caveat here, and that is, in both of these examples, we were only evaluating one project. If you were evaluating 4 projects and you can only do one, there are 4 projects out there, you can only do one, use net present value, and you select the one that has the highest net present value. Okay, but you can't use the internal rate of return in that case because there's a couple of reasons. There's scope issues, there's timing issues. Scope of the project means the actual cost invested into the different projects. There's timing issues, which means when money is being paid out, when the cash flows. So if you're evaluating one issue, you just want to know if you can do one project, you can use both. If you have to evaluate a number of different projects, 4 or 5, you want to choose the best, only use net present value. Accounting rate of return, you can read over that at your leisure. It's really straightforward. And the payback method. The payback method is by far the weakest. It should only be used if you're looking at really small projects, small in terms of cash. Because the payback value doesn't take into consideration time, value, of money, so it's by far the weakest. And you're probably, unless your small project is not really a big deal, but for big projects, you can get the wrong conclusion. And that is the session. I'm sorry it took so long. I know it would be a lot. I didn't expect it to be here until almost 8 o'clock.
All right.
But that's the session. One thing, everybody, if you have any questions, feel free to send me an email, and I'll answer any questions that you may have.